For the one guy in my comment section who came after me for my Natty Light, even though I asked you not to come after me for my Natty Light, I've got some scotch, okay? We're gonna fix this, okay? Cheers. All right, so the title of the video is, does Harley Davidson copy Indian motorcycles? And the reason I want to address this is because really since the 23.5 model year, when Harley Davidson launched its redesigned bodywork for the Street Glide and the Road Glide on the CVO models, and then ultimately on the regular Street Glide and Road Glide in 2024, I saw repeatedly in the comment sections that the bikes now look like Indians, that Harley had copied Indian motorcycle. And so I thought I should do a video talking about that because it's something that personally frustrates me. And not because I'm a Harley fanboy, although obviously I am a Harley fanboy, but because it just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. And when I was thinking about and when I was writing the script for this video, a lot of it centered around the history of Harley Davidson, because obviously Harley's been building Batwing fairings and Shark Nose fairings, the Road Glide and the Street Glide respectively, for over 4 decades in the case of both fairings, right? I mean, the Tour Glide fairing came out in like 79 or something, and the Batwing came out even before that. So Harley obviously has been building these two fairing designs for a really long time. And the lineage, as each redesign has happened, is quite clear, right? You can see the DNA, you can see the history from each fairing to the next. And so I think that it's just kind of weird to argue that they've copied anyone when they originated those designs. You can't copy someone if you did it first. And so I was going to showcase, like I said, the various iterations of each fairing, and I was going to compare and contrast the design elements that each fairing has. And ultimately, I'm not a designer. I don't think that would be particularly compelling because who trusts what I have to say about design? That's just not in my wheelhouse. I think that it misses why I feel so strongly about this in the first place. If you don't know my background's in education. So I have a teaching credential in secondary social studies. So that basically means that I can be a high school history teacher or an anesthesiologist, you know, one of the two. But one of the things that I always liked to talk to my students about was this idea of reframing. When you're reading an article or when you're reading a headline or when you're asking a question, how you phrase it matters a lot. It dictates what kind of answers you're gonna get. And it actually, in many cases, limits the scope of your understanding. And so I took a step back from the question, does Harley Davidson copy Indian? And I realized that if I reframed the question, I got much closer to understanding why I was frustrated. And my reframed question is, why does Polaris only build motorcycles in product segments that Harley already exists in? So to take a step back, there's a whole bunch of different motorcycle brands, and most motorcycle brands compete in a variety of segments with other manufacturers. Let's take BMW for example. BMW builds a R18 heritage-inspired cruiser with a big air-cooled Boxer twin engine, but they also build an S1000RR that they use to compete in World Superbike. So BMW builds bikes in Harley's product segments, like the heritage cruisers that they build on the R18 platform, but they also build bikes that Harley doesn't compete in the product segment for. And there's been time periods where Harley Davidson has actually entered into BMW's more traditional product segments, like with the Pan America. Harley looked at the data for Street Glide and Road Glide owners and found that a significant percentage of them also owned a BMW GS. And so they set about designing a product that would compete with the BMW GS because in their mind, if you already own one Harley, you're probably going to consider owning a second. And there are some brands that don't build a single heritage cruiser that have almost no overlap with a manufacturer like Harley Davidson. KTM, for example, they build lots of dirt bikes and naked sport bikes, but they really don't build anything that you could consider a cruiser. But Indian is kind of a unique animal in this regard. They build the Scout, which is obviously a competitor to the Sportster. They build the Chief lineup, which is a direct competitor to the Softails and the previous Dynas. And then they have their two bagger varieties, which coincidentally, and as an aside, they're the only other company other than Harley Davidson to have two different fairings for their baggers available to the public. They build a Shark Nose and a Batwing. Kind of a weird coincidence if you believe in that sort of thing, but I'm the kind of guy who would say that it's not a coincidence at all. And mind you, this isn't the only two possible shapes for fairings. There are other companies that build a batwing. I talked about BMW earlier. They've sort of introduced their own version, but Honda has been quietly building one of the best baggers in the industry for a long period of time in the Goldwing, and it's never really had a batwing or a shark nose fairing, and it's always been a successful option. It's got a great motor in its flat six. It's super reliable, it's handled well, and it's been a crowd favorite for a long time. And it's definitely charted its own path in the bagger segment. And even if you look at the designs of the Vaquero and the Eluder, which are Kawasaki's and Yamaha's baggers, it's hard to argue that they share a huge amount of resemblance with either a batwing or a shark nose design. And yet Indian, again, is the only other company with two fairings, and somehow they managed to build both a shark nose and a batwing. And it keeps bringing me back to this question of why Indian doesn't build anything that isn't a direct competitor to a Harley-Davidson product. Now, there was one exception to what I'm talking about, and it was the Indian FTR, which they just killed off. But even that product, right, was designed to be a flat tracker of sorts aesthetically, right? And that's obviously something very closely associated with the history of Harley-Davidson racing. And it wasn't, in my opinion, a full-fledged, full-faith effort on the part of Polaris. It reused the power plant from the Scout, and that meant that if you were someone that wasn't already interested in Indian or potentially flat track, right, and you just wanted a competitive naked sport bike, the FTR ended up being like 100 pounds heavier than most of its competitors because it was using the engine from a cruiser platform. And that doesn't inherently mean it's a bad bike, but when you're trying to attract people from other brands, one of the easiest ways you can do it is by offering competitive specs. And I think that Polaris showed that they were never that invested in building something radically different because they were just trying to reuse stuff that they already had on hand. You could argue that something like the Pan America, which has a completely new engine platform specifically designed for it, that then gets reused in things like the lighter weight, more technologically advanced cruisers that Harley also builds in the form of the Nightster and the Sportster S, is a more radical engine design than whatever was in the FTR. But we haven't fully addressed why I'm mad, right? I mean, so what? Am I arguing that Indian essentially exists solely as a foil to Harley-Davidson? I mean, what's the harm in that, right? I mean, so Harley has some extra competition. That means Harley's gonna probably develop things faster and price their bikes more competitively, and they're gonna have to offer a better bike at a better price. And we all know what competition does. Obviously, that's nothing really to be mad about. I do think that Indian iterated enough where I don't look at their bike and go, that's a direct copy of a Road Glide. The Challenger is clearly inspired by the Road Glide, and it's supposed to entice a Road Glide buyer to something that has a little bit more power and maybe a little bit better suspension. It was a performance-focused alternative to a Road Glide. With their liquid-cooled motor, they distinguished it enough from the Road Glide that I wouldn't call it a copy. I mean, aesthetically, obviously, the fairing on the Challenger is heavily inspired by the Road Glide fairings that predate it. But again, I'm not mad because Indian built the Challenger. It doesn't accurately reflect why I feel the way that I feel. What frustrates me most is that it didn't have to be this way. It's actually the limitations of Harley-Davidson that frustrate me most about Indian. The United States already has the premium, best heavyweight cruiser manufacturer in the world, Harley-Davidson. In fact, Harley-Davidson is so dominant in the product category that another American motorcycle manufacturer can do nothing but build direct competitors to Harley-Davidson's. Indian has a rich history of really high-tech bikes, inline four engines, all sorts of crazy stuff that sometimes beat Harley to the market. And instead of Polaris resurrecting this brand and using it to prove what an American motorcycle manufacturer can actually be, and going out and building an inline four sport bike and building a dirt bike to compete with the Japanese brands and building an adventure bike before Harley-Davidson built one and building a naked sport bike that is a full faith effort, right? Not just a bike that reuses a hopped up motor out of a Scout. But instead, we're left with what is essentially just a bunch of direct competitors to Harley's products that maybe have a liquid cooled motor or maybe have inverted suspension or maybe have more 50s style Indian looking aesthetic to them, but that ultimately are big V twin cruisers. I don't have a problem with big V twin cruisers. I love big V twin cruisers, but we didn't need even more American big V twin cruisers. We needed something that would get us out of our pigeonhole, that would get us into direct competition with the rest of the world. What really inspired me to reframe the question was both the death of the FTR and the Super Chief RT. The death of the FTR just showed that Indian doesn't have a really strong desire to compete in segments that Harley's not in, right? They see themselves as a foil to Harley Davidson. They don't see the FTR as being part of their identity, or they would keep it alive. There's plenty of brands that keep products alive because they're so quintessential to the idea of the brand that even if they're not selling particularly well, they're gonna figure out a way to rework that product until it sells well because it is that brand. And so the death of the FTR showed that Polaris, they don't really care that much about doing something different. And on the opposite side of that spectrum, the Super Chief RT showed that if Harley's doing something that's successful, Indian needs something in that product segment as quick as they can possibly get it. The Lowrider ST is out and it's selling like hotcakes. Well, then we need our competitor to the Lowrider S, the Super Chief, with some saddlebags on it, right? Because that's gonna sell well too. And you know what? We don't have a lot of time to redesign a new fairing for it, so just slap some lunch pails on the side of it and send it to market because we need something in that product segment, whether or not we believe in the product itself or not. And so that's what has brought the Scotch out, right? It's the idea that Harley-Davidson's mind share in the American motorcycle market is so potent that the only other major American motorcycle manufacturer can do nothing but be an alternative to Harley. They can't be their own brand. They can only be the manufacturer of the machine that you buy if you don't want to buy a Harley. And that's sad. It's a shame. And I don't know what's to blame for that. I don't know if it's because Indian lacks its own personal identity and the guys at the top are just looking for a way to bring competitive products to the market. And the easiest way to do that is to pick whatever is selling for Harley and build their version of it that maybe has a liquid cooled motor or a little bit more horsepower or is a little bit less expensive or maybe some combination of all three. Or maybe it's the customer base. Harley's one of the few motorcycle manufacturers that when they build a bike that doesn't have an air-cooled V-twin in it, everyone points at it and says, that's not a real Harley. And maybe that's starting to rub off on Indian. So this video is a long way of saying that I think the idea that Harley copies Indian is kind of laughable because it's pretty clear that Indian exists solely as an alternative to Harley-Davidson. And you can't really copy someone that is basically a copy of you. And I think that's just sad. I was actually excited when Polaris bought Indian. It can go out there and it can do something different and it's got the bank of Polaris behind it. And the only bike that they built that was even remotely different than Harley is dead. And I think we're all worse off for it. Anyways, if you think Harley's copying Indian, put it down in the comment section. Otherwise, I'm out. So I'll see you in the next one.